They laughed, humiliated, put him in embarrassing situations until one day everything changed. No one knew what he was capable of, but now they'll never forget it. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments what city you're from. The first day at Westbrook Academy felt like stepping into another world. The pristine, white buildings, trimmed hedges, and marble hallways radiated an air of exclusivity, a silent reminder that this was a school for the privileged. The students who walked these halls carried themselves with effortless confidence, their uniforms pressed to perfection, their conversations laced with the kind of entitlement that only came from generations of wealth. Jaden had never belonged to a place like this. He wasn't born into money, nor did his family have deep-rooted connections with the city's elite. The only reason he was here was his mind. His academic performance had been outstanding, enough to earn him a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious private schools in the state. Westbrook prided itself on diversity initiatives, but as Jaden quickly learned, being the only black student in a school filled with rich white teenagers wasn't diversity. It was isolation. From the moment he stepped onto campus, he could feel the stares. They weren't outright hostile, but they weren't welcoming either. Students whispered behind their hands when he passed, casting sideways glances as if he were an exhibit rather than a person. He knew what they were thinking. He didn't belong. At first, he tried to convince himself that he was overanalyzing, that maybe it was just his nerves making him paranoid. But by the end of the first week, he could no longer deny the truth. It started with the little things. His desk in every class seemed to always have a mark on it. Sometimes a faint scratch, other times a crude drawing that hadn't been there the day before. A snicker from the back row when he walked in. The way some students would glance at him, then exchange knowing looks. At lunch, he sat alone, not because he wanted to, but because no one made room for him. The teachers weren't overtly racist, but they didn't intervene either. When a few students loudly joked about affirmative action during history class, Mr. Calloway didn't tell them to stop. He just moved on with the lesson. When his English teacher, Mrs. Hanover, called on him, she did so with a careful politeness, the kind reserved for an outsider, not a student she genuinely wanted to hear from. Then there was Chad. Chad Wellington III. Even his name sounded like privilege. He was the school's golden boy, the kind of guy who had everything: money, looks, athletic talent, and a father who sat on the school's board of trustees. He was the captain of the lacrosse team, the heir to a family business, and, most importantly, the self-proclaimed king of Westbrook Academy. Jaden had caught his attention on the first day. He hadn't done anything in particular, just walked past him in the hallway, but that was enough. Chad had taken one look at him, smirked, and nudged one of his friends. That smirk had stayed with him. It wasn't curiosity or even casual amusement. It was something more insidious, as if Chad had already decided what Jaden was: an intruder. The first real incident happened in the hallway outside chemistry class. Jaden had been walking toward his locker when a sharp impact hit his shoulder. His books slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a thud. He barely had time to register what had happened before Chad strolled past him, feigning innocence. "Oh, sorry," Chad said, not bothering to stop. "Didn't see you there." Behind him, a few students snickered. Jaden clenched his jaw and bent down to pick up his books. No one helped. That was how it began. Chad and his group of followers, guys like Ryan who laughed at every one of Chad's jokes, and Trent who seemed to exist solely to echo whatever Chad said, took it upon themselves to remind Jaden daily that he was not one of them. Sometimes it was subtle. A shoulder check in the hallway, a whispered insult just low enough that a teacher wouldn't hear. Other times, it was more blatant. One morning, Jaden arrived at his locker to find it covered in sticky notes. Dozens of them, all scribbled with different variations of the same message. Go back where you came from. Affirmative action mistake. You don't belong. He stood there, staring at them, his hands clenched into fists. The hallway buzzed with students moving to class, but no one acknowledged what had happened. Some glanced his way, saw what was on the locker, and quickly looked away. Others snickered as they passed. Jaden took a slow breath and started peeling them off one by one. He knew what they wanted, to see him react, to see him lash out so they could claim he was the problem. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. But inside, something was beginning to shift. He had spent his whole life believing that if he just worked hard enough, if he just proved himself, he could belong. That if he kept his head down, stayed out of trouble, and focused on his goals, he could be accepted. Westbrook was teaching him a different lesson. It didn't matter how smart he was. It didn't matter how respectful or hard-working he tried to be. To them, he would always be an outsider. And Chad wasn't going to stop. The thought settled in his mind, heavy and certain. This was only the beginning. Jaden had hoped, foolishly, that the hostility would die down, that Chad and his friends would grow bored and move on to someone else. But Westbrook was a place where cruelty thrived when left unchecked, and Chad thrived on control. Ignoring him only made him more determined. The small provocations turned into something more frequent, more calculated, more humiliating. The first time they tampered with his belongings, it was subtle. His textbooks would disappear from his locker, only to be found hours later in the trash or left out in the rain. His gym bag went missing before PE, forcing him to wear the school's lost and found clothes that smelled of mildew and sweat. No one saw anything. No one said anything. Teachers dismissed it as a simple mix-up, but Jaden knew better. Chad and his group watched him closely, waiting for a reaction, waiting for him to break. In class, the insults grew sharper, more direct. When a teacher asked Jaden to solve a problem on the board, Chad leaned over to Ryan and muttered loud enough for others to hear. "Must be nice to have the school hand you everything." Laughter followed, quiet but unmistakable. Jaden clenched his fists, but he kept his head down and finished writing his answer. At lunch, he sat alone. Not because he wanted to, but because the few times he tried to sit near other students, Chad or one of his friends would make a snide comment. They didn't even have to tell people not to sit with him. Their presence alone was enough to keep others at a distance. No one wanted to be associated with him, not when it meant becoming the next target. He forced himself to eat quickly, ignoring the occasional piece of food that landed near his tray, always thrown from a few tables away, but never traced back to anyone specific. The worst came on the day of the chemistry lab. They were paired off, but when Jaden's name was called, no one volunteered to work with him. He sat alone at his station while the rest of the class whispered and laughed, while the teacher awkwardly hesitated before sighing and saying, "Jaden, why don't you join?" Before Chad cut in smoothly, "I'll work with him." The teacher looked relieved and nodded, moving on. Jaden knew this wouldn't end well. Chad sat across from him, grinning like they were old friends. He let Jaden do most of the work, only occasionally making sarcastic comments. Then, right as Jaden finished measuring the solution, Chad accidentally knocked the beaker over, spilling the liquid all over Jaden's worksheet and onto his lap. "My bad," Chad said, smiling. The class burst into laughter. The teacher sighed, shaking his head, but didn't reprimand him. Jaden gritted his teeth, grabbed some paper towels, and started cleaning up. His hands were shaking, but not from embarrassment, from anger. The next morning, he found his locker covered in notes again. This time, they weren't just words. Someone had drawn crude pictures, mocking his features, exaggerated in a way that left no room for interpretation. He stood there, staring at them, willing himself to breathe. Students passed by, pretending not to see, but their silence was its own kind of message. Later that day, as he walked toward the gym for PE, he overheard Chad and his friends talking in hushed voices. He didn't know what they were planning, but he could feel it. That sense of anticipation, that electric charge in the air before something bad happened. And then it did. In the locker room, after class, Jaden reached for his bag, only to find it soaked in something thick and sticky. He pulled it open, and the stench hit him immediately. Rotten milk. Laughter erupted behind him. He turned, gripping the bag in his hand, staring at Chad, who was leaning casually against the lockers, arms crossed, smirking. "Man, that sucks," Chad said. "Must be hard when you don't belong." Jaden's breathing was heavy, his pulse pounding in his ears. Every part of him screamed to do something, to say something, to fight back. But what would that accomplish? If he lashed out, they'd twist the story. They'd make him the problem. They'd call him aggressive, a troublemaker. They'd play the victims, and he knew the school would take their side. So he did nothing. He clenched his fists, exhaled slowly, and turned away. He walked out of the locker room, leaving the ruined bag behind. That night, as he sat in his room staring at the ceiling, he realized something. They weren't going to stop. No amount of ignoring them would make them stop. If anything, it made them bolder. They wanted him to break, and if he didn't fight back, they would just keep pushing until he did. Jaden had spent his life believing that if he just kept his head down and worked hard, people would judge him for his achievements, not his skin color. He had believed that excellence would protect him. Westbrook had taught him a different lesson. They would never stop, not unless he made them. Jaden lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. The stench of spoiled milk still clung to his skin, no matter how many times he had scrubbed his hands. His gym bag, ruined and reeking, was stuffed into a garbage bag in the corner of his room. He could still hear their laughter in his head, still see the smug look on Chad's face, as if he had just proven something, as if he had won. The worst part wasn't the humiliation. It wasn't even the anger, though that was burning deep inside him, hotter and stronger than ever before. It was the helplessness. All his life, Jaden had believed in the power of hard work. His mother had raised him to believe that if he worked twice as hard, if he stayed focused and didn't cause trouble, he would succeed. He had carried that lesson with him like armor, trusting that as long as he was the best at what he did, no one could take that from him. But Westbrook didn't work that way. It didn't matter how smart he was. It didn't matter that he had earned his place at this school. In their eyes, he would never belong. And the worst part, he had let them do this to him. He had let them push him around. He had let them laugh at him. He had let Chad and his friends turn him into a joke. No more. Jaden sat up, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, rubbing his hands together, his palms sweaty. He thought back to his childhood, to the man who had always told him that strength wasn't about size or intimidation. It was about control. His grandfather, Elijah Carter, had been a fighter, not just in the ring, where he had built a career as a professional boxer, but in life. He had grown up in a time and place where a black man had to fight for everything he had. He had taught Jaden discipline, patience, and, most importantly, that strength wasn't about revenge. It was about never letting someone else decide your worth. Jaden hadn't trained in years. After his grandfather passed, his mother had urged him to focus on school, worried that fighting would only lead to trouble. She didn't want him to be seen as aggressive, as another statistic. And so he had let it go, choosing books over fists, believing that knowledge was the only power he needed. But knowledge alone wasn't enough here. He stood up and walked over to his closet, pushing aside his school uniforms and pulling out a box from the back corner. He knelt down, wiping the dust off the lid, and slowly lifted it open. Inside were his old training wraps, slightly worn but still sturdy. His grandfather's old gloves, too big for his hands when he was a kid, but now fitting just right. A notebook filled with training routines, drawn in careful handwriting, each page reminding him of the lessons he had learned years ago. He wrapped his hands, pulling the cloth tight around his knuckles, and took a deep breath. Then, slowly, methodically, he dropped into a fighting stance. The first punches were sloppy. His body had forgotten the rhythm, the technique. His balance was off, but he kept going, throwing jabs into the air, feeling his muscles remember, feeling the movements settle into him like an old song. By the time the sun started to rise, sweat dripped from his forehead, his arms ached, and his knuckles were raw. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something shift inside him. He wasn't helpless. He wasn't weak. He wasn't going to let them break him. The next day at school, something was different. He walked through the halls the same way he always had, but this time he carried himself differently. He didn't slouch. He didn't avoid eye contact. He moved with purpose, with quiet confidence. Chad noticed. Jaden could see it in the way his eyes narrowed as they passed each other in the hallway. There was no smirk this time, no casual bump of the shoulder, just a flicker of something close to irritation. Chad didn't like change. He didn't like losing control. At lunch, Jaden sat alone, but he didn't hunch over his tray like he usually did. He ate slowly, methodically, as if he had all the time in the world. Across the cafeteria, Chad leaned back in his chair, watching him, drumming his fingers against the table. The game had changed, and Chad could feel it. Jaden wasn't playing defense anymore, and soon Chad would realize that he had picked a fight with the wrong person. Jaden walked through the halls of Westbrook Academy with a presence that hadn't been there before. He wasn't taller. He wasn't bigger. He wasn't stronger than he had been a day ago, but something had shifted. He could feel it in the way his steps landed, firm and steady. He could see it in the way people glanced at him, noticing something different but unable to put their finger on it. Chad noticed too. Jaden didn't look away when their eyes met. He didn't drop his gaze or hesitate when walking past him. There was no fear, no uncertainty. Chad didn't say anything the first time it happened, but the way his jaw tightened, the slight twitch in his fingers, told Jaden that he felt it. The air between them was different now. It wasn't immediate, but over the next few days, Chad's need to push back became obvious. It started with little things. Stepping too close in the hallway, brushing past him in the cafeteria a little too forcefully, making comments just loud enough for Jaden to hear. Testing him. watching for a reaction. Jaden gave him nothing. At lunch, when Chad knocked over his water bottle as he passed by, Jaden didn't flinch. He picked it up, set it back on the table, and continued eating like nothing had happened. When Chad tried to shoulder check him in the hallway, Jaden didn't stumble. He absorbed the impact and kept walking, not even looking back. Each time, Chad's frustration grew more obvious. Jaden wasn't playing his game anymore. But Chad wasn't the type to let things go. He didn't like when things stopped going his way, and he sure as hell didn't like feeling powerless. He needed control, and Jaden refusing to react took that away from him. So Chad did what he always did. He escalated. The cafeteria was crowded as usual, filled with the dull roar of conversations, laughter, and the occasional clatter of trays. Jaden sat alone, eating slowly, his focus sharp. He knew something was coming. He had seen the way Chad and his group huddled near the entrance, whispering, throwing occasional glances in his direction. He had felt the weight of their stares, the way they were sizing him up. Then the footsteps came. Chad walked toward him with Ryan and Trent at his sides, all three moving with the ease of people who had never once worried about consequences. The room didn't go silent, but conversations dipped as people took notice. Jaden didn't move as Chad stopped at the end of his table. "Hey, superstar," Chad said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure people nearby heard him. "Missed you at rehearsal. You're not quitting show business, are you?" Jaden didn't look up. He chewed, swallowed, and reached for his drink. Chad frowned, shifting his weight slightly. He hated being ignored. Ryan and Trent chuckled, but it was forced. They were waiting for Jaden to react, waiting for something to break the tension. Jaden finally looked up, meeting Chad's gaze. Something in his expression must have unsettled Chad, because the smirk wavered for just a fraction of a second. But he recovered quickly, and before Jaden could respond, Chad grabbed his tray and flipped it, sending food cascading onto Jaden's lap. A collective gasp rippled through the cafeteria. Forks clattered onto trays. Conversations halted. Chad stood back, arms crossed, waiting. Jaden sat completely still. A bead of sauce slid down his shirt. His mashed potatoes dripped onto the floor. He could feel the room watching, waiting for his reaction. In the past, he would have clenched his fists, dropped his gaze, swallowed the anger, and walked away. But that wasn't who he was anymore. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back without a sound. He looked down at the mess on his clothes, then at Chad. The room held its breath. Chad smirked, pleased with himself. "Oh, you finally got something to say, loser?" Jaden stepped forward, closing the space between them. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that was almost unsettling. And then, with a voice so steady it sent a ripple of unease through the room, he said, "Hit me." The cafeteria went silent. Chad blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Jaden didn't move, didn't break eye contact. "You like proving how tough you are, right?" he said, his tone so casual it was almost eerie. "Go ahead, hit me." For the first time, Chad hesitated. Jaden could see it, the flicker of doubt, the calculation. Chad was used to people backing down. He was used to control, and right now he didn't have it. The cafeteria was watching. Chad had put on a show, but now the show wasn't going the way he had planned. He had expected Jaden to shrink, to slink away in humiliation. Instead, Jaden had stepped into the moment and turned it back on him. Chad clenched his jaw. He had to do something. He had to remind everyone who he was. So he swung. Jaden had been waiting for it. Before Chad's fist could connect, Jaden shifted his weight, pivoting smoothly to the side. Chad's punch hit nothing but air, the force of his own momentum pulling him forward off balance. Gasps echoed through the cafeteria. Chad stumbled, his eyes wide with shock, and before he could recover, Jaden stepped forward and swept his leg out from under him with precise, practiced efficiency. Chad hit the floor hard. Silence. Every eye in the cafeteria was on them. Chad lay on his back, staring up at Jaden, his face red with humiliation, his body tense with disbelief. He had never been bested before, never been made to look weak in front of a crowd. Jaden looked down at him, his expression unreadable. He wasn't gloating, he wasn't angry, he was simply done. Then he turned, picked up his bag, and walked out of the cafeteria without another word. The silence lasted only a few seconds before the murmurs began, spreading like wildfire. For the first time in his life, Chad Wellington III wasn't the one in control. And for the first time, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Jaden walked out of the cafeteria, his pulse steady, his hands relaxed. The hallway was empty, silent compared to the buzzing chaos he had left behind. He could still hear the gasps, the hushed whispers, the stunned expressions frozen on the faces of students who had just witnessed something they had never expected to see. He didn't need to look back to know that Chad was still on the floor, trying to process what had just happened. For the first time since stepping into Westbrook Academy, Jaden wasn't the one being humiliated. He wasn't proud. He wasn't exhilarated. He wasn't even angry anymore. He had simply done what needed to be done. And that, more than anything, was what unnerved Chad the most. Jaden knew how this worked. Chad would come after him. Not today, maybe not even tomorrow, but he would, because people like Chad didn't let things go. They couldn't afford to. His power at Westbrook wasn't built on friendships or respect. It was built on fear. And now that fear had shifted. Jaden had taken it from him. By the time he reached the restroom, he could hear the distant sound of movement from the cafeteria. The show was over. Chad was probably back on his feet, his face burning with embarrassment, his friends trying to figure out how to salvage his reputation. Jaden walked up to the sink and turned on the faucet. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, the remnants of food still smeared on his shirt. The moment replayed in his head, the way Chad's fist had cut through the air, the way Jaden had moved just in time, the weightless instant before Chad crashed onto the cold tile floor. It had been too easy. Chad wasn't a fighter. He was just a bully who had never faced real resistance. Jaden rinsed his hands, wiped his face, and pulled off his stained shirt, leaving only his undershirt. The cold air felt good against his skin. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. He didn't regret it. The doors to the restroom swung open. Jaden turned, already knowing who it was. Ryan and Trent stood just inside the doorway, their usual cocky expressions replaced with something uncertain. They weren't laughing now. They weren't sneering. Jaden held their gaze, waiting. Trent shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Ryan, who seemed just as unsure. Neither of them had expected this. "Chad's pissed," Ryan finally said, crossing his arms. Jaden grabbed a few paper towels and dried his hands. "I bet he is." Trent let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Dude, what the hell was that? You just—" He gestured vaguely, as if the memory of Chad hitting the ground was still too shocking to put into words. Jaden tossed the paper towels into the trash and grabbed his bag. He didn't answer. Ryan exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, man, I don't know what your deal is, but you just made a big mistake. Chad's not gonna let this go." Jaden finally turned to face them fully, his expression calm. "Then tell him to try again." Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but didn't. Instead, he just stared, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Jaden stepped past them and walked out, leaving them standing there. By the time he returned to class, the rumors had already spread. People turned their heads when he entered the room. Some whispered to their friends, others just stared. Even the teacher hesitated for a moment before continuing the lesson. Jaden ignored it. He took his seat, opened his notebook, and focused. The whispers didn't stop. When the bell rang, he could hear students talking in the hallway. Bits and pieces of conversations reached his ears. "Did you see Chad's face? He was furious. Dude, Jaden dodged like it was nothing. He didn't even look mad, he just moved. Chad got wrecked. Jaden didn't stop walking, didn't acknowledge any of it. He had done what he had to do. That was all." As he turned the corner, he saw Chad standing by his locker, Ryan and Trent next to him. Chad's face was composed, but his hands were clenched at his sides. He was controlling his anger, trying not to show weakness. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Jaden didn't slow down. He didn't need to say anything. Chad had already lost. The next day, Chad didn't show up to school. His absence wasn't officially noted. His family had enough influence to excuse him from class without question, but everyone knew why he wasn't there. The cafeteria incident had spread like wildfire, and there wasn't a single student at Westbrook Academy who hadn't heard about it. Jaden didn't need to check his phone to know that videos had already circulated, whispers had already grown into full-blown stories, and that Chad Wellington III had suffered the worst fate imaginable for someone like him. He had been humiliated. Jaden wasn't sure how he felt about it. He had never set out to ruin Chad. That wasn't what this was about. He hadn't even fought back in the way Chad had expected. He had simply moved, let Chad's own arrogance send him crashing to the floor. That was what made it worse. Chad had beaten himself. The energy at school was different now. Jaden could feel it in the way students looked at him, not with mockery, not with pity, but with something closer to curiosity. Respect. The ones who had once laughed at him behind his back were quieter now. Even the teachers, who had always remained carefully neutral, seemed to look at him differently, like they had underestimated him, like they weren't sure who he really was anymore. Ryan and Trent were still circling, unsure of what to do. Without Chad leading them, they seemed lost, their confidence shaken. Trent had even nodded at Jaden when they passed each other in the hallway, as if acknowledging something he didn't have the words to explain. By lunch, the shift had fully settled in. Jaden sat at his usual table, but this time it wasn't just him. A few students, ones who had never dared to sit near him before, had casually taken seats at the same table. They didn't talk to him directly, but they were there. They had seen what he had done, and they wanted to be near him now. Jaden didn't acknowledge them, but he understood what it meant. Meanwhile, Chad's absence left a hole in the school's social structure. Without him, no one knew where to direct their loyalty. The power he had held over Westbrook had been built on the certainty that he was untouchable. But now, everyone had seen him fall, and that certainty had shattered. He would come back. That much was inevitable. The question was, what would he do when he did? It wasn't until 2 days later that Chad returned. Jaden was at his locker when he heard the familiar footsteps behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "I know you're there, Chad," Jaden said without looking up. The silence stretched for a moment. Then Chad cleared his throat, trying to sound casual. "You think you won, huh?" Jaden finally turned to face him. Chad looked different. He still held himself with confidence, but it wasn't the same effortless arrogance as before. There was something forced about it now, something brittle. His eyes flickered with something close to resentment, but also something else, hesitation. Jaden studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I don't need to win, Chad," he said quietly. "I just need you to understand one thing." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Chad could hear. "You're never going to hurt me again." Chad swallowed. He wanted to say something, to throw out one last insult, one last jab to reclaim some sense of control. But the truth was written all over Jaden's face. He wasn't afraid anymore. And without fear to feed on, Chad had nothing. For the first time, Chad knew what it felt like to be powerless. Chad didn't respond. His lips parted slightly like he wanted to say something, to throw out one final insult, to regain the upper hand. But there was nothing left for him to hold on to. The control he had once wielded so easily, the fear he had used to keep others beneath him, it was gone. And Jaden could see it. The moment stretched between them in the crowded hallway, the noise of students passing by fading into the background. Chad's eyes flickered with something unreadable, something unsettled. Jaden had seen a lot of emotions in his expression before: mockery, arrogance, amusement, even satisfaction. But this was different. This was uncertainty. Jaden didn't step back, didn't let his posture waver. He didn't need to. The power dynamic had shifted, and Chad knew it. Jaden turned away first, closing his locker with deliberate ease, slinging his bag over his shoulder and walking down the hall without another word. He could still feel Chad standing there, frozen, processing. The rest of the school was watching, pretending not to, pretending to be focused on their own lives, but the tension in the air was undeniable. Chad had ruled Westbrook Academy for years. He had dictated the social order, determined who was in and who was out, controlled people through fear, through cruelty, through the knowledge that no one could touch him. Now, the entire school had seen him lose. The whispers followed Jaden all the way to class. Chad didn't show up again for the rest of the day. Jaden wasn't sure what he had expected, but as the hours passed, it became clear that Chad wasn't going to retaliate immediately. Maybe he was still processing. Maybe he didn't know how. The school was still buzzing with the fallout of the cafeteria incident, and for the first time since he had arrived at Westbrook, Jaden felt something close to normal. People still looked at him, but the way they looked had changed. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't pity. It wasn't dismissal. It was something else. Respect. That afternoon, as Jaden walked out of the school building, he saw Chad leaning against the hood of his car in the parking lot, arms crossed, staring at the pavement. His usual entourage wasn't with him. Ryan and Trent had spent the day trying to act like nothing had changed. But without Chad there to set the tone, they were just as lost as the rest of the school. Jaden didn't slow down as he walked past him. He expected Chad to ignore him, maybe drive off without a word, but instead, Chad did something unexpected. He spoke. "I was wrong about you." Jaden stopped. He turned just enough to look at Chad, who still hadn't moved, still had his arms crossed, still had his gaze locked on the pavement. Jaden didn't say anything. He waited. Chad exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I thought you were just another weak kid," he admitted, voice quieter than usual, lacking its usual sharpness. "Thought you'd break, like all the others. Jaden tilted his head slightly, watching him. And now? Chad finally looked up, meeting his gaze. Now, I know better. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a murmur, Chad muttered, "I'm sorry." Jaden didn't flinch. He didn't react immediately. Didn't let the words sway him. He studied Chad's face, searching for insincerity, for calculation, for anything that felt like a trick. But there was none. It wasn't enough to erase everything Chad had done. It wasn't enough to make up for the years of cruelty, the months of torment, but it was something. Jaden gave him a single nod. Then he turned and walked away. Chad didn't call after him. Didn't try to stop him. Didn't demand anything more. And, for the first time since he had arrived at Westbrook, Jaden walked home with his head held high. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Jaden had experienced since arriving at Westbrook Academy. The world had shifted, subtle at first, but undeniably real. The air felt lighter, the hallways less suffocating. People still watched him, still whispered, but it wasn't the same as before. There was no mockery, no cruel amusement. Instead, there was something closer to quiet acknowledgement. Chad was different now, too. He still had his pride, still walked with the confidence of someone who had been at the top for too long to fully let it go. But there was hesitation in him now, a new awareness that had never been there before. He didn't shove past people in the hallways anymore. He didn't toss out casual insults, didn't laugh as his friends made someone else the target. He wasn't friendly with Jaden, wasn't suddenly trying to be his friend, but he no longer acted as if he was above him. That, in itself, was a change. The biggest shift came in the cafeteria. Jaden had grown used to sitting alone, to taking his meals in silence while the rest of the school carried on without him. But now, things were different. One day, as he sat down at his usual table, a few students hesitated before pulling out chairs around him. They didn't say anything, didn't try to start a conversation, but they sat with him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Ryan and Trent still hung around Chad, but their dynamic had changed. Without fear holding them together, they seemed less like his followers and more like just a couple of guys trying to figure out where they stood. Even they had stopped sneering at Jaden in the halls. If anything, they had taken to looking away when they passed him, as if they didn't quite know how to face him now that they weren't above him. Jaden didn't revel in their discomfort. He didn't feel the urge to rub his victory in their faces. That wasn't what this had been about. He had never wanted revenge, had never wanted to humiliate anyone the way they had humiliated him. All he had ever wanted was to be left alone, to be respected. And now, finally, he was. One afternoon, as Jaden walked through the halls, he heard footsteps approaching behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He slowed his pace slightly, waiting, and after a moment Chad fell into step beside him. They walked in silence for a few moments before Chad finally spoke. "I still don't get it," he admitted. Jaden glanced at him. "What?" Chad exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Why you didn't take it further. You could have. After what I did to you, after everything." He shook his head. "If it were me, I wouldn't have stopped." Jaden thought about that for a moment before answering. "That's the difference between us." Chad chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, I guess it is." They reached the stairwell. Chad hesitated, as if debating whether to say more, but in the end, he just gave Jaden a nod before turning the other way. That was the last time they ever really spoke. Jaden didn't become the new king of Westbrook. He didn't take Chad's place, didn't use his victory to make others feel small. That wasn't who he was. He had never wanted power, only peace. And now, for the first time, he had it. There would always be people like Chad, people who needed to prove themselves by making others feel lesser. But Jaden had learned something in the past few weeks. Bullies only had power if you let them have it. The moment you stood up, the moment you refused to give them control, they had nothing. Fear was their greatest weapon, and once you took that away, they had already lost. As Jaden walked home that evening, feeling the crisp air against his skin, he realized something. This wasn't just about Chad. This was about him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't just feel strong. He felt free. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos and don't miss what's coming next. Share this video with someone who might need to hear this message.